Ordinary stuff. Thick, not worth much.
Thick yourself. Look at the pattern.
Yes, well?
Did you see what it is?
Abstract pattern.
Roger, you're being stupid on purpose. Look at that part. It's an owl's head, see?
Yes? Well, I suppose it is if you want it to be. 3 leafy heads with this kind of abstract flowery business in between.
It's
yes, I
not
suppose so.
abstract flowery, that's the body. If you take the design off the plate and fit it together, it makes a complete owl, see? There you are. It's an owl.
Yes, it is. An owl. No, that's quite good. I like him.
Her.
You can tell. Okay, I like her. Hello there.
Don't do that.
You what?
Don't touch her.
Yeah, get your hands off my paper owl, you bastard. Okay, so today we are reviewing The Owl Service by Alan Garner, published in 1967. The clip you've just seen is from the Granada television production of the same novel back in 1969. That's when it was first aired. I'll explain what that clip's all about a little bit later, but it's at the very beginning and sets up the whole mysterious plot that unfolds. Now, this book was recommended to me by me old mate Alan Timbrell. We studied fine art together back in the day down in Plymouth, recently reconnected via social media, and I saw on one of his posts that he was celebrating International Book Day by photographing a small collection of his favourite Alan Garner books. I'd never heard of this author before, but like a magpie with a particular penchant for splendid book covers, my interest was piqued. So I asked him where should I start my adventures with Alan Garner, and he recommended The Owl Service. So that's where I have begun, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. Incidentally, if you would like to peruse some of Aran's splendid illustrations, there's a link down below to his Instagram account, and you can have a nice little gander at what he's been up to over the past few years or so. Anyway, let's crack on. So as ever, let's begin with a little perusal of the copy I've got here today. So mine dates from 1975, and I chose it on the strength of the cover illustration itself. That's it there, that's the scan of it. Later on there's going to be some other ones that have come over the past 57 years. It's been reprinted lots of times, so see which one you think is your favourite. But this is mine, and I'm going to tell you why. So I'm not quite sure if my particular copy has been bleached in any way. It does seem to have a bit of a bluish tinge to the whole thing, which normally suggests it's had some kind of light damage, but perhaps it was supposed to be that way. I've got no way of knowing. The thing I like about it is that it juxtaposes the 3 main elements of the story. So in the very background, we've got this ghostly outline of a plate that we saw featured in that first clip. In fact, it's actually the same one that features in that clip by the looks of it. We've also got one of the main protagonists, Alison, who you also saw in the clip there. Here she's rendered quite interestingly with 2 different light sources coming from either side of her and slightly behind, but also in front of her as well. So we've got a very strange lighting setup there. It must have been quite tricky to paint, I imagine, but it makes for quite an arresting image. She's gazing at us with quite a strange expression on her face. We can't quite work out what's going on. It's almost confrontational, I would say, but also passive. She's looking beyond us even, which is quite interesting. Then if we look at her body, we see that at first glance, perhaps she's holding a massive bouquet of flowers, but then we realise that the flowers are actually part of her body. So she's kind of being transformed into flowers, potentially. Yeah, I really love that image. What do you think? Okay, the next thing I'd like to talk about before we get into the book itself is that, as can be discerned from the Armada Lion imprint here, we're dealing with a book that is ostensibly for children or young adults. It's also, I suppose you could call it low fantasy, in that it has fantastical elements within the natural world that we all experience and inhabit. Just as an aside, I mean, because I'm a writer myself, albeit a self-published failure of one, I do follow the trends in writing generally. And I know that over the past 10 years, young adult fiction has completely exploded. It's the most lucrative form of writing you can be doing, and publishers are all over the damn stuff. So I have a cursory interest in it anyway. So I look at the bestsellers, and occasionally I'll read the first chapter of a book just to see what all the fuss is about. And I must say that the standard appears to be absolutely dreadful. Derivative, badly written, poorly edited, utter shambles, and yet this stuff's gobbled up. The same cannot be said for the Owl Service. Unlike its modern counterparts, it's brilliantly written, and it doesn't assume young adults to be idiots or undiscerning of quality. So, first of all, it's a brilliant service, an Owl Service to young readers, I would say. Right, so this story is all based around a piece of Welsh folklore, blodeuwedd. Blodeuwedd? I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher every single Welsh name in this little review here, so apologies if you're Welsh. I'm trying. I've looked up the pronunciation and it's tricky to say the least, but blodeuwedd. Anyway, so this tells the story of, this piece of folklore at least, tells the story of a beautiful young woman who's conjured from flowers by a powerful magician called Gwydion. As far as I know, this Welsh term blodeuwedd is a compound word, which literally translates to flower-faced. So, yes, she's been created from flowers for the purposes of, it seems like potentially a gift for this man who's cursed never to have a wife. So blodeuwedd is for this man. Unfortunately for the magician and this unfortunately cursed man, blodeuwedd has other plans, and she falls in love with another man, Huw. Huw ends up murdering this cursed man, and Gwydion, the magician, isn't best pleased and turns this poor woman into an owl. So there we are. That's the genesis, really, of this story, or the inspiration for what unfolds within the story. The reawakening of this myth within the Welsh valleys of 1960s Wales. Okay, so very much like this piece of mythology suggests, we have three main players here. We have the young woman and her two suitors, shall we say. And in this story, they are transposed into three teenagers. So we have Alison, who is blodeuwedd, apologies. And we also have Roger, who's her half-brother, Roger, another English chap. So Alison and Roger are English. And then at this holiday home that they're staying in Wales, there's a housemaid, and her son Gwyn is one of that three as well. So that's the kind of love triangle, if you will. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm not going to talk too much about the story itself, really, because that's quite interesting in its own right, and I don't think I'd be able to do justice to it anyway. But what I will do is set it up somewhat. So again, we're casting our memories back to that clip at the beginning, and it's how this all begins. It's on the first few pages of the book. So Alison is recuperating from some kind of illness. We don't really know what it is, some kind of malady that allows her to be bedridden for a number of days. Over the course of her convalescence, she notices this sound of scratching coming from above the ceiling, so in the loft space above. And she gets Gwyn, this young Welsh chap, Welsh boy, to go up and investigate. In so doing, he discovers this great big stack of plates. So at the beginning, before I knew anything about this book, I thought the Owl Service is like some kind of club that you belong to in service to the mighty owl. It's nothing to do with that, of course. It's like a dinner service, I suppose. These plates used to call them dinner services, or posh people do, I imagine. And so it's the owl service. So on these plates, there's an interesting print, which we've already seen there. And it's a strange abstract melding between flowers and owls. Anyway, so once this plate, they just bring one plate down to begin with, and Alison becomes obsessed with it. And she promptly begins tracing the patterns she sees on the plate using paper. And all she sees, she's not really seeing the flowers, she's seeing parts of an owl. And so that's how she cobbles together this strange looking paper owl. Interestingly, that once she's transposed this owl into paper form, the print on the plate disappears. I mean, they speculate about how that might have happened. Perhaps the glaze gets washed off or whatever. But yeah, you soon discover that these patterns are disappearing as she's creating these paper owls, but also that these paper owls are disappearing from her. She doesn't know where they're going. She's making them, leaving them around, and then they just, go away somewhere. We find out where they go actually later on. That's not a spoiler. But anyway, her doing this kind of rite, I suppose you could call it, sets in motion this myth that's laid buried within this valley for many years. The creation of these owls has unlocked the spell, and soon these three teenagers are woven into this myth once more, and it plays out in a certain way. This is a tragic story, obviously, the folklore part. Whether or not this story will be tragic, I'll leave to you, the dear reader, if you choose to read it. That would be a spoiler, obviously. Let's begin by talking about the quality of the writing then, which is absolutely fantastic. The prose are elegant and often poetic, revelling in the beauty of the Welsh countryside. Nature itself seems almost venerated in this writing. It pulses with a vitality that seems to build and build until towards the end it's almost a supernatural entity in and of itself, which is only fitting because the mythology of blodeuwedd, upon which this whole story is crafted, is herself derived from nature. So it's only fitting that the description and the exploration of this beauty functions as an extra character alongside those other three. Okay, so I thought to illustrate this point, I would just do a little bit of a reading from the beginning of the story here. The second chapter, this is Roger getting rogered in the river. No, this is Roger just splashing around in the river, just exploring the environment that surrounds the house in which they're staying. So here we go, let's just read this, just a few paragraphs. Roger splashed through the shallows of the bank. A slab of rock stood out from the ground close by him, and he sprawled backwards into the foam of meadowsweet that grew thickly around its base. He gathered the stems in his arms and pulled the milky heads down over his face to shield him from the sun. Through the flowers he could see a jet trail moving across the sky, but the only sounds were the river and a farmer calling sheep somewhere up the valley. The mountains were gentle in the heat. The ridge above the house, crowned with a grove of fir trees, looked black against the summer light. He breathed the cool, sweet air of the flowers. He felt the sun drag deep in his limbs. Oh, lovely. All right, so before I continue talking about how much I love this book, I thought I would just inject this little bit of poison here. So this is the one little bit of the book that I didn't like personally. It probably speaks more to my failings as a reader than Garner as a writer, but it was the way the family were introduced in the story, because it was quite a dynamic family scenario, especially for the times, because you've got Alison there, the young English girl. She's there with her mother, who you never actually meet. She's usually asleep or she's out walking or something. Then you've got Roger, her half brother, and his father, who's recently divorced. Alison's father's died. I don't know if you find out what happened to him. So this is a recent marriage, a recent merging of two families. Then on the top of that, you've also got the young Welsh lad, Gwyn, and his mother, who's the housemaid. So I didn't understand fully the dynamic until, I don't know, a third or halfway through the book, something like that. So when when characters were mentioned, for example, when Alison was calling her father by his name, I thought, well, that's an odd thing to do. So I didn't understand at the beginning what was going on. But perhaps that's my problem. I don't know. But I just thought I'd mention that. So before I talk about the more supernatural elements of the story, I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about the dynamic that's going on culturally between these relatively well-off English tourists and the poor Welsh help, if you will, that's serving them at this holiday home. At the beginning, you definitely become aware of a bit of antagonism between the two, but this slowly builds until towards the end it's too much, and things are starting to fall down in that regard. And you can see why. Obviously, you've got these well-off, middle-class English people coming to Wales, having a wonderful, jolly old time, and at the same time not being aware of the culture that's surrounding them, if you will. The Welsh people that they encounter in the village switching automatically to Welsh when they're around. There's a kind of a suspicion, I suppose, of these people that are coming into their domain at the same time. But at the beginning, I think the English family, this posh family, are perhaps tolerating the help, if you will, or they're almost ignoring them. But as time goes on, Roger specifically has a dislike of Gwyn, the Welsh boy, because it's probably impinging on his relationship with Alison, who is actually is his half sister. But at the same time, yeah, that's the love triangle going on. So, but when things start going awry between these two boys, this aspect of Gwyn's poorness, his humble background, is brought up by Roger as something he can use as a weapon against him. And I'm speaking from my own perspective. I've come from pretty humble beginnings myself, in that I have an innate suspicion or dislike of people that are more privileged, if you will. So I can see like Gwyn and his mother's perspective here as well, aside from the cultural issues going on. Okay, I think it's time now to talk about more of the supernatural, fantastical elements of the story without giving anything too much away. I think it does a wonderful balance between events and happenings that are very subtle and ones that are out there, obviously something very odd's going on. So on the subtle side of things, you've got just perhaps the way the environment is responding, a chill in the air, or shadows, or the passage of clouds. You've also got a moment that I remember where Alison's sitting at her window and looking at a pool of water, looking at her reflection and wondering which one is her. Is she herself, or is the reflection her? I mean, there's quite odd things that are going on that are just slightly off kilter. Then you've got the more overt stuff going on. There's a scene where Roger is following Alison into the woods at night, and he's definitely observing things that shouldn't be there. I mean, he's trying to rationalize it as like swamp gas or something like that, but there's definitely something going on there. At times it becomes really quite unsettling. You feel for these characters in these situations. Something profound is going on, and you really wouldn't want to be in that situation. Another aspect of the story which heightens this feeling of eeriness and even isolation has less to do with the supernatural happenings than it does the cultural mixture of having these English tourists within the Welsh setting. This English family, in fact, are kind of witless interlopers within this little community. They know very little about the culture within which they're immersed and care even less. The use of the Welsh language whenever the English people are around is one aspect of this kind of heightening of tension. But of course, there's also this suggestion that the villagers know that something's going on, that this has happened before perhaps, and they are casually observing the consequences of what's being played out. There's also the suggestion that they're willing participants in what eventually unfolds. Okay, further to this, I would just like to mention one last character that I really enjoyed, and that's Huw Halfbacon, the Welsh caretaker of the holiday home. So he's the groundsman, really. He's managing the upkeep of the house and the garden, things like that. Often you encounter him not really doing very much. He's often staring into space or mumbling to himself. When the children try to engage him in conversation, he doesn't necessarily speak in riddles, but the way he speaks is very odd. He won't give direct answers to questions, and sometimes the answers he gives might be to questions they haven't even asked, that kind of thing. There's something more to this man than meets the eye. In fact, there's one scene, I can't recall it correctly and I can't find it in the book now, but one of them asks why he's called Huw Halfbacon, the Halfbacon being the nickname he's been given, and it's something about, it's a trade he did once for pigs or something like sort of cattle, and it's as though he performed some kind of spell and made the other farmer believe that what he was trading was far more valuable than it was. But the way he says it, kind of with a bit of a smile, as though it's something that's readily disbelieved, and it's old Huw just spinning yarns again. But there's certainly more to him than meets the eye. Interestingly, Roger's father just passes him off really as a country bumpkin or a simpleton. Even Gwyn's mother, the housemaid, has horrible things to say about him, but we discover why later on. But I really liked that character because he's kind of timeless. Almost, it's as though he's existed there for far longer than you can imagine, and it reminded me of the character of Tom Bombadil in the Lord of the Rings series. This kind of living, almost mythical creature in his own right. Although you don't see any outward signs that he's in any way magical, but there's something a bit odd about him. Okay, so the very last thing I'll talk about that I loved about this book was something that the author probably didn't consciously imbue the story with, but was rather a consequence of the time it was written, and that being the age, that dark age before the internet existed. And I'm personally, I have the benefit of growing up before the internet. I mean, I suppose people growing up now would consider that a curse of sorts, but I think my childhood was enriched by not having that distraction. I mean, I had the distraction of television perhaps, which was the main curse of the day, and also the first home computer we had, the Commodore 64. I absolutely loved playing games. But other than that, we spent our time out in the garden mostly. Digging up old coins, and we had an old bomb shelter, and we'd go in there and explore it, and an old pig shed at the bottom of the garden that had loads of horrible spiders, and old bottles, loads of old bottles that my dad had dug up on digs. He likes finding old bottles. And then in the house itself, we lived in a really old house, and I remember our bedroom, when I was very young, it still had the old faded linoleum that was there before, and the wallpaper was old, and then just focusing on things, doing things with our fingers. Books like Things to Make and Do, cutting up paper, making things like Alison with the owls. I mean, that's just the kind of stuff we used to do. Tracings, doing rubbings of different textures and patterns, and added to that, all of the media that we engaged with was second-hand or hand-me-down books. So books and comics or comic annuals that were from another time, another decade, from the 60s and 70s perhaps. But in so doing, I personally was engaging in a time that was before my lived time of the 80s. I was engaging with media of the 70s. And so all of that, all of those influences, they created an atmosphere of my childhood of kind of industriousness, of making do, spending time doing things constructively rather than passively absorbing stuff off the internet and watching hardcore pornography, as many children like to do these days, apparently. It's just such a lovely way to grow up. And this book reminded me of that beauty, of that alternate way of existing. Of course, the paradigm has shifted now, and what I consider now to be a terrible upbringing for children growing up now is, for them, is perfectly normal. And to make the decision as to which was best is completely pointless, because things have moved on and the ideals have changed. But this book just brought it home to me, what it's like, or what it was like to grow up then in the 70s and 80s, perhaps. Yeah, so I just wanted to add that on the end. Okay, so right, it's probably time to rate the devil now. So if we bring it down. So as much as I loved this book, I am going to give it 4 out of 5, not the full set. And that's largely to do with what I was saying about the beginning, the confusion I had at the beginning. I think if I read this as a child, if I had read this back in the 80s or the early 90s, for example, I think I would have struggled with this. Primarily because my reading ability wasn't very good when I was younger. For who knows why. It was either bad teaching or I needed glasses. They didn't know I needed glasses until I was, 12? Or, I don't know, dyslexia potentially. I still struggle sometimes to read big passages without my eyes going all over the place, but undiagnosed. But for whatever reason, yeah, I would have struggled to read this. Even now, as I've already said, and that's why I've deducted a star, is because I struggled slightly. But that's probably my own failing as a reader than the actual quality of the writing. If you've read it yourself, I'd like to hear your opinions on that specifically. I'll have to ask Aran as well what he thought. But I think certainly I'm going to enjoy it far more by reading it a second time, which I plan to do before this year is ended. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. A really, really beautiful little book. And I will read another Alan Garner in the future. I think the next one would be Redshift. I think Aran recommended that one next. But anyway, there we are. There's my rambling review of the Owl Service. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time for another video, whatever that might be. Anyway, cheerio.